The coffee in cup 37 had gone cold again. Sarah Martinez stared at the dark liquid, watching the oil-slick patterns swirl on its surface like tiny storms, and wondered if this would be the night her world finally collapsed completely. The fluorescent lights above Murphy's truck stop buzzed with that particular frequency that made your teeth ache, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made even the healthiest faces look like they belonged in a morgue. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, the kind of deep night hour when the world feels hollow and every shadow could be hiding something terrible. Outside, the interstate hummed with the constant flow of 18-wheelers carrying America's goods through the darkness, their drivers sustained by nothing but caffeine, amphetamines, and the promise of home at the end of another endless highway. But inside Murphy's, there was only the sound of Sarah's racing heart and the weight of eyes that had been watching her for 3 hours straight. Derek Walsh sat in booth 7 like a spider in the center of its web, his untouched apple pie growing stale while his gaze followed Sarah's every movement with the kind of predatory focus that made her skin crawl. She'd stopped looking directly at him an hour ago, but she could feel him there, a malevolent presence that seemed to suck the warmth out of the air around her. Tonight was different. Tonight, there was something bulging in the right pocket of his worn denim jacket, something that caught the light wrong and made her hands shake every time she thought about what it might be. If you believe that heroes can emerge from the most unexpected places, that ordinary Tuesday nights can become the stage for extraordinary acts of courage, and that sometimes the people society fears most are exactly the ones who step up when innocent lives hang in the balance, then pause for a moment. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to believe in guardian angels, subscribe to this channel, and tell us in the comments below where you're watching from tonight. Because this story will remind you that sometimes salvation rides a Harley-Davidson and wears a leather jacket. Sarah Elena Martinez had learned about loss before most people learned to drive. She was 19 when the phone call came, a state trooper's voice, professional but kind, explaining that her parents' Camry had been hit head-on by a drunk driver on Interstate 70. They died instantly, he said, as if that was supposed to be a comfort, as if the speed of their death somehow lessened the crater it left in her world. Her grandmother, Elena Rodriguez Martinez, had flown in from Phoenix for the funeral, a 72-year-old woman with hands like leather and a backbone made of pure steel. Elena had raised 8 children during the farm worker strikes of the 70s, had buried a husband who died of lung disease at 55, and had somehow managed to put 3 of her kids through college on a house cleaner's salary. Mija, she'd said at the graveside, her weathered hand gripping Sarah's with surprising strength. Grief is not something you get over. It's something you learn to carry. And right now, you and me, we're going to carry each other. So Sarah had dropped out of community college, moved in with her grandmother, and learned to navigate a world that suddenly seemed full of sharp edges and hidden traps. For 3 years, they'd built a quiet life together in the small town of Cedar Falls. Sarah working days at a local diner, Elena tending to her garden and volunteering at the church food bank. Then, the cancer came. It started as a persistent cough that Elena dismissed as just getting old. But by the time they caught it, the disease had already spread through her lungs like wildfire through dry grass. The doctors spoke in careful euphemisms about aggressive treatment options and managing expectations. But the bottom line was brutally simple. Elena Rodriguez Martinez was dying, and the only question was whether she'd have months or weeks. The medical bills arrived like a tsunami. Even with Medicaid, the cost of chemotherapy, radiation, and the endless parade of specialist appointments quickly consumed every penny Sarah had saved. She took on extra shifts, sold her car, and bought a used bicycle, moved them both into a smaller apartment above the town's only laundromat. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. That's when she'd heard about the night shift at Murphy's truck stop, 40 miles outside town on the interstate. The pay was better than anywhere else she could find, and the hours meant she could still be home during the day to take Elena to her appointments. The job came with risks, working alone through the dangerous hours, when the highways belong to insomniacs, addicts, and predators. But Sarah had learned that sometimes you don't get to choose between safe and necessary. For 8 months, she made the drive to Murphy's 5 nights a week, serving coffee and consolation to truckers, insomniacs, and highway wanderers. Most of her customers were decent people just trying to make it through another long night, but there were others men who looked at her like she was something they could purchase along with their coffee and pie. Derek Walsh was the worst of them. He'd first appeared 3 weeks ago, sliding into booth 7 just after midnight and ordering apple pie he never ate and coffee he barely touched. He was maybe 45, with the kind of thin, ropey build that suggested a life lived on cigarettes and cheap beer. His eyes were pale blue and never seemed to blink often enough. And when he smiled, it was the kind of expression that belonged on something crawling out from under a rock. At first, his attention had seemed almost innocent, just another lonely highway drifter looking for someone to talk to. But the questions started getting personal, invasive. Where did she live? Did she have a boyfriend? What time did she get off work? When she politely deflected, his mood would shift, and something cold and calculating would flicker behind his pale eyes. He started staying later, timing his visits to coincide with the dead hours when Sarah was most likely to be alone. He'd sit in booth 7, barely touching his order, just watching her move through her routine with an intensity that made her feel like an animal being stalked by a predator. Tonight, when he'd walked in at 11:47 p.m., Sarah had noticed the bulge in his jacket pocket immediately. It was too big to be a wallet, too heavy for keys, and it caught the light in a way that made her blood run cold. She'd seen enough movies to recognize the outline of a handgun, and the knowledge sat in her stomach like a block of ice. The only other customer in the place was a man she'd never seen before, a big guy, in a black leather jacket sitting at the counter, nursing coffee and reading something on his phone. He looked like exactly the kind of person her grandmother would have warned her about. All scars and tattoos and barely contained violence. But tonight, as Derek's stare grew more intense and the weight in his pocket seemed to get heavier, Sarah found herself hoping that the stranger in leather might be exactly the kind of dangerous she needed. Jake Thunder Morrison had been running from his past for 23 years, but tonight it had finally caught up with him in a truck-stop diner 60 miles outside Cedar Falls. Not literally, the ghosts that haunted him weren't the kind that could be arrested or reasoned with, but in the form of a young woman whose fear reminded him so much of his sister Katie that it hurt to breathe. Katie had been 21 when she'd married Brad Hutchins, a charming, clean-cut guy who worked at the local auto parts store and coached Little League on weekends. To everyone in their small Ohio town, Brad was the perfect husband, attentive, successful, devoted to his young wife. Behind closed doors, he was a monster. The abuse had started small, the way it always does. A grip on her arm that left bruises, raised voices that escalated into thrown objects, apologies that came with flowers and promises that it would never happen again. Katie had hidden it well, making excuses for the bruises, wearing long sleeves in summer, gradually isolating herself from friends and family. Jake had been 25 then, fresh out of the army and working construction, too caught up in his own problems to notice that his baby sister was slowly disappearing before his eyes. He'd seen the signs, the flinching when Brad raised his voice, the way Katie had stopped laughing, the careful makeup that never quite covered the shadows under her eyes, but he'd told himself it wasn't his business, that married couples worked things out on their own. The call had come on a Tuesday morning in March. Katie had tried to leave, Brad had stopped her, and by the time the neighbors called the police, she was already gone. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, but Jake knew the real cause was his own cowardice, his failure to step in when someone he loved needed protection. Brad Hutchins got 15 years for manslaughter. He was out in 7. Jake had spent the next 2 decades carrying that guilt like a stone in his chest, channeling his rage into iron and chrome, finding brotherhood among other broken men who understood that some debts could only be paid forward. The Broken Chain Motorcycle Club wasn't like the gangs you saw in movies. They weren't criminals or outlaws. Just men who'd learned that sometimes the only thing standing between innocent people and the monsters who hunted them was the willingness to take a stand. The club had been founded by a Vietnam veteran named Frank Prophet Rodriguez, who'd returned from the war to find his hometown overrun by drug dealers and predators. Frank had gathered together other veterans, construction workers, mechanics, and truck drivers, men who knew how to handle themselves and who shared a simple philosophy: protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Over the years, the broken chain had quietly built a reputation throughout the interstate corridor. They helped stranded motorists, escorted abuse victims to safe houses, and made it known that certain behaviors wouldn't be tolerated in their territory. They didn't seek publicity or recognition. Their reward was the knowledge that they were making a difference. One highway, one truck stop, one terrified woman at a time. Jake had been riding with a broken chain for 15 years, rising through the ranks to become road captain, the man responsible for coordinating the club's activities across 3 states. He was respected among the brotherhood, not for his size or his capacity for violence, but for his ability to read situations, to sense when trouble was brewing before it exploded into violence. Tonight, that sense was screaming at him. He'd stopped at Murphy's purely by chance, his regular route home from a club meeting in Kansas City, a place to grab coffee and stretch his legs before the final push to Cedar Falls. But from the moment he'd walked through the door, every instinct he'd developed over 2 decades of watching out for the vulnerable had been firing alarm bells. The young waitress Sarah, according to her name tag, was terrified. It was there in the set of her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward Booth 7. The tremor in her hands when she'd poured his coffee. And the man in Booth 7 was the kind of predator Jake had learned to recognize from 100 yards away, the hungry stare, the careful positioning, the patient stalking behavior of someone planning something terrible. Jake had dealt with men like this before. They were cowards at heart, bullies who preyed on the isolated and vulnerable, who always backed down when confronted by someone willing to fight back. But they were also unpredictable, capable of lashing out with sudden violence when their fantasies were threatened. As he watched Sarah move through her routine, Jake felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders. He could finish his coffee, pay his check, and drive away, telling himself it wasn't his problem, that he couldn't save everyone. That's what he would have done 23 years ago, and his sister would have paid the price for his cowardice. Not again. Never again. When Sarah approached with the coffee pot, Jake saw the desperation in her eyes and knew that tonight, finally, he might have a chance to save the sister he'd failed all those years ago. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly, she could barely hold the coffee pot steady. She'd been watching Derek for the past hour, and his behavior was escalating in ways that made her skin crawl. The muttering had gotten louder, the staring more intense, and twice she'd seen him reach into his jacket pocket and touch whatever was hidden there. The worst part was the way he was looking at her now, not with the usual leering interest, but with something colder, more calculating. Like he was making plans. Like he was working up the courage to act on thoughts that had been festering in his mind for weeks. She tried calling her manager again, but Frank Kowalski was probably drunk in his trailer by now, and even if she could reach him, what would she say? That a customer was making her uncomfortable? That she had a bad feeling? Frank would tell her to suck it up or find another job, and she couldn't afford to lose this position, not with Elena's treatment costs climbing every month. The stranger at the counter, the biker, with the leather jacket and the watchful eyes, had been nursing the same cup of coffee for 45 minutes. Under normal circumstances, that would have annoyed her, but tonight his presence felt like a lifeline. He was big enough to handle himself, and something about the way he carried himself suggested he'd been in situations like this before. But how do you ask a stranger for help without sounding crazy? How do you explain that your gut is screaming danger without any concrete evidence beyond a feeling? When the biker motioned for a refill, Sarah made her decision. She grabbed a napkin from the dispenser, her heart hammering against her ribs, and quickly scrawled a message in handwriting that shook with desperation. "He has a gun. Please help me." It was a leap of faith, trusting a stranger who looked like he could be just as dangerous as the man she was afraid of. But something in the biker's eyes, a steadiness, a quiet authority, made her believe that he might be exactly the kind of dangerous she needed on her side. As she walked over to refill his cup, Sarah felt like she was walking to the edge of a cliff, not knowing if she was about to be saved or if she was about to make the worst mistake of her life. The biker, his name tag would have read Jake if he'd been wearing one, accepted the refill with a nod of thanks. When Sarah slipped the napkin next to his cup, he palmed it smoothly, his expression never changing. But she saw something shift in his posture, a subtle coiling of tension that reminded her of a snake preparing to strike. Jake read the note without looking at it directly, his years of military training allowing him to process the words while maintaining his casual demeanor. For simple words that confirmed everything his instincts had been telling him. This woman was in immediate danger, and he was the only thing standing between her and whatever the man in Booth 7 was planning. Without drawing attention to himself, Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The broken chain had protocols for situations like this, code words that could summon help faster than calling 911. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, sending a text message that would wake up 5 of his brothers across the county. Code 7. Murphy's truck stop, Interstate 70. Come now. Code 7 was reserved for the worst situations, imminent threat to innocent life, immediate response required. It meant dropping everything, grabbing your jacket and your bike, and riding hard towards someone who needed the Brotherhood's protection. Within 30 seconds of sending the message, Jake's phone was buzzing with responses, rolling. ETA, 15 minutes. Stone, on my way. Diesel, coming in hot. Preacher, already on the road. Nomad, 2 minutes out, was already riding. Tank being 2 minutes out was a stroke of luck. He must have been heading home from a late shift at the plant. That meant Jake wouldn't have to handle this alone. For long, wouldn't have to worry about the situation escalating before backup arrived. He looked up from his phone to find Sarah watching him, with hopeful, terrified eyes. Jake gave her the slightest nod, a gesture that said, "I've got you. You're not alone anymore," and saw some of the tension leave her shoulders. Now came the hardest part, waiting for his brothers to arrive while keeping Derek Walsh from acting on whatever violent fantasy was playing out in his head. Derek Walsh had been planning this for 2 weeks now, ever since he'd first worked up the courage to follow Sarah home after a shift. She lived in a crappy apartment above a laundromat, rode a beat-up bicycle to work, and appeared to have no boyfriend, no family, no one who would miss her if she disappeared. She was perfect. Derek had been thinking about women like Sarah his entire life, young, pretty, vulnerable women who worked alone in isolated places, who smiled at customers because they had to, not because they wanted to. He'd been collecting pictures of them for years, following them, learning their routines, building elaborate fantasies about what he'd do if he ever worked up the courage to act. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But it had always been just fantasies, just daydreams that helped him get through another lonely night in another cheap motel room. Until he'd lost his job at the lumber yard 3 months ago. Until his ex-wife had started proceedings to garnish his wages for back child support. Until the walls of his life had closed in so tight he could barely breathe. That's when the fantasies had started feeling less like escape and more like planning. He'd bought the gun from a guy behind a gas station in Missouri, a small, .38 revolver that felt heavy and powerful in his pocket. Just holding it made him feel different, made him feel like he had options. Like he didn't have to spend the rest of his life being ignored and dismissed by women who were too good for him. The plan was simple. Wait until Sarah was alone, walk her to her car, and convince her to come with him. The gun would make her compliant, would keep her from screaming or fighting. He'd take her somewhere quiet, somewhere they could get to know each other properly, and maybe she'd learn to appreciate a man who knew how to take charge. If she didn't, well, the gun would solve that problem too. Derek had been psyching himself up for this moment for hours, running through scenarios in his head, imagining how it would feel to finally take control, to stop being the kind of man women looked through, like he was invisible. But now there was a complication. The biker at the counter hadn't left when he should have, was still sitting there nursing his coffee like he owned the place. Derek had seen guys like him before, military maybe, or construction, the kind of man who thought he was tough because he had muscles and tattoos. Derek touched the gun in his pocket and felt his confidence return. Muscles didn't matter when you had a .38. Tattoos didn't stop bullets. If the biker tried to interfere, Derek would handle him too. He watched Sarah move behind the counter, bending over to refill the sugar dispensers, and felt his pulse quicken. Soon, very soon now. The sound of motorcycles in the distance made him look up from his untouched pie. Probably just truckers, or maybe some other bikers stopping for gas. It didn't matter. Nothing was going to stop what was about to happen. Derek Walsh had been invisible for 43 years, and tonight, finally, someone was going to notice him. The sound started as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across a clear sky. But instead of fading, it grew louder, deeper, until the very windows of Murphy's truck stop began to vibrate with the harmonic resonance of multiple Harley-Davidson engines running. In perfect synchronization, Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always came before action, the calm focus that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Afghanistan and countless dangerous situations since. His brothers were coming, and soon the odds would shift decisively in favor of justice. Sarah looked toward the windows with wide, frightened eyes, probably thinking that more dangerous men were arriving to complicate an already terrifying situation. She couldn't know that the approaching thunder was the sound of salvation wrapped in chrome and leather. Derek Walsh shifted nervously in his booth, his hand moving instinctively toward his jacket pocket. He was smart enough to recognize that the arrival of multiple bikers changed the dynamic of whatever he'd been planning, but probably too committed to his course of action to back down now. Men like Derek rarely possess the wisdom to cut their losses and run. The first bike to roar into the parking lot belonged to Tank Rodriguez Prophet's son and the Broken Chains enforcer. Tank was 6'4" and built like a concrete wall, with forearms the size of most men's thighs and a beard that made him look like a Viking who'd wandered into the 21st century. Despite his intimidating appearance, Tank was one of the gentlest souls Jake had ever known, a man who worked with special needs children during the day and spent his evenings volunteering at a veterans shelter. But Derek Walsh didn't know that. All Derek saw was 260 pounds of leather-clad intimidation walking through the door with the confidence of a man who'd never backed down from a fight. Stone Martinez arrived 30 seconds behind Tank, his bike a custom-built machine that sounded like controlled thunder. Stone was smaller than Tank, but carried himself with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to fight in places where losing meant dying. He'd done 3 tours in Iraq as a Marine sniper, and the experience had left him with a 1,000-yard stare and an absolute intolerance for bullies. Diesel Murphy rolled in third, followed by Preacher Williams and Nomad Johnson. Each man was different builds, different backgrounds, different reasons for riding with the broken chain. But they all shared the same quiet intensity, the same readiness to step between innocent people and those who would harm them. They didn't storm into the diner like some movie gang. Instead, they entered calmly, methodically, spreading out to cover the exits and establish control of the space. To a casual observer, they might have looked like a group of friends stopping for late-night coffee, but their positioning was pure tactical precision. Derek Walsh found himself surrounded by 6 men who radiated competence and barely contained violence. These weren't the cartoon bikers from television shows. They were working-class heroes who'd chosen to spend their free time protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Jake stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "Evening, boys," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to fill the diner. "Hell of a night for a ride." "Evening, Thunder," Tank replied, settling his massive frame into a booth that seemed to shrink around him. "Thought we'd stop in for some coffee. Heard this place serves the best pie in 3 counties. The other bikers took their seats, each choosing a position that gave them a clear line of sight to Derek Walsh. They ordered coffee and dessert like regular customers, but their presence had transformed the atmosphere of the diner completely. Sarah stood behind the counter, tears of relief streaming down her face as she realized what was happening. These men, these dangerous-looking strangers had come because the biker at the counter had called them. They were here to protect her. Derek Walsh looked around the diner and felt his carefully constructed fantasy beginning to crumble. The gun in his pocket suddenly felt less like power and more like evidence of his own stupidity. 6 against 1 was bad odds under any circumstances, but 6 bikers against 1 wannabe predator was a massacre waiting to happen. But he'd come too far to back down now. He'd been planning this for weeks, had worked himself up to the point where retreat felt like another kind of death. His hand closed around the grip of the .38, and he tried to summon the courage to stand up and take control of the situation. That's when Jake Morrison looked directly at him for the first time, and Derek Walsh realized he was staring into the eyes of a man who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again if necessary. The tension in Murphy's truck stop was thick enough to cut with a knife. Derek Walsh sat frozen in booth 7, his hand clutching the gun in his pocket, while 6 members of the Broken Chain Motorcycle Club calmly sipped coffee and created an impenetrable wall between him and his first intended victim. Jake Morrison had been in situations like this before moments, when violence hung in the air like smoke, when the wrong word or gesture could trigger an explosion that would leave good people hurt or dead. The key was to project strength without aggression, to make it clear that resistance was futile while offering an honorable way out. "Sarah," Jake said quietly, never taking his eyes off Derek. "Why don't you take a break in the back room? Maybe call your manager. Let him know we've got some late-night customers who might be staying for a while." She nodded gratefully and disappeared through the kitchen door, finally out of Derek's line of sight. With the immediate threat to her removed, Jake could focus on diffusing the situation before it escalated into bloodshed. Derek Walsh was sweating now, his pale eyes darting between the bikers like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, and Jake could see the telltale signs of a man working himself up to do something desperate and stupid. "You know," Jake said conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather, "I've been riding these highways for 20 years. And I've learned something interesting about men who carry guns into diners at 3 in the morning." Derek's grip on the weapon tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do," Stone interjected, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd interrogated insurgents in Fallujah. "You've got something in your jacket pocket that doesn't belong there. Something that's making you feel brave and stupid at the same time." Tank leaned forward, his massive hands wrapped around a coffee cup that looked like a toy in his grip. "I've got a daughter about Sarah's age," he said quietly. "Works nights at a hospital in Kansas City. And every time she goes to work, I worry about men like you predators who think a gun makes them powerful. You don't know anything about me." Derek snarled, but his voice cracked with fear. "Actually, we know everything about you," Preacher said, his tone almost sympathetic. Preacher had earned his nickname not because he was religious, but because he had a gift for talking sense into dangerous situations. "We know you've been coming here for weeks, watching her, learning her routine. We know you've been following her home, probably taking pictures, building up fantasies about what you'd like to do to her." Derek's face went pale. How could they possibly know all that? "Men like you always follow the same pattern," Diesel explained. "You start with watching, then stalking, then escalating to action. Tonight was supposed to be the night you stopped fantasizing and started acting, wasn't it?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Derek could deny it, could claim he was just a regular customer who liked apple pie. But they all knew the truth. The only question now was whether he was smart enough to walk away or stupid enough to force a confrontation he couldn't win. "Here's what's going to happen," Jake said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that could cut steel. "You're going to reach into your jacket very slowly. Remove whatever you've got in there and place it on the table. Then you're going to stand up, walk out that door, get in your car, and drive away from this town. You're going to forget this place exists, forget she exists, and find somewhere else to work through whatever's eating at you." "And if I don't?" Derek asked, trying to inject some defiance into his voice. Tank smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Well, then we'll have to discuss your behavior in a more direct manner. And trust me, friend, that's a conversation you don't want to have." The silence stretched out for long seconds, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the interstate. Derek's hand trembled as he calculated his options, all of which seemed to end badly for him. Finally, with infinite care, he reached into his jacket and slowly withdrew a small .38 revolver. The weapon looked pathetic in the harsh fluorescent light, a cheap, worn piece of metal that represented the worst of human nature. He placed it on the formica table with shaking fingers, and immediately the atmosphere in the diner changed. The bikers relaxed slightly, the immediate threat of violence diminishing with the weapon surrender. Preacher walked over calmly and picked up the gun, checking the cylinder before removing the bullets and pocketing both. "Consider this a donation to keeping the peace," he said. Derek Walsh sat in stunned silence for a moment, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. Without the gun, he was just a pathetic middle-aged man who'd been caught planning something terrible. The fantasy that had sustained him for weeks had collapsed completely, leaving him face to face with the ugliness of his own intentions. You're getting a second chance here, Jake told him. Most men in your situation don't get that luxury. I suggest you use it wisely. Derek stood up on unsteady legs, threw a $20 bill on the table, and walked toward the door without looking back. As he reached for the handle, Tank's voice stopped him. One more thing, the big biker said quietly. Word travels fast among truckers and highway folks. If we hear you've surfaced somewhere else, if any woman reports being stalked or threatened by someone matching your description, we'll find you. And next time, we won't be so understanding. Derek Walsh left Murphy's truck stop and never came back. He drove straight through to the next state, sold his car for cash, and disappeared into the anonymous sprawl of America's forgotten places. Whether he learned from the experience or simply became more careful about his predatory behavior was something only God and his future victims would know. In the quiet that followed Derek Walsh's departure, Sarah emerged from the kitchen like a woman stepping out of a nightmare into sunlight. Her face was streaked with tears, but for the first time in weeks, they weren't tears of fear. Is he really gone? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He's gone, Jake confirmed, and he won't be coming back. The bikers finished their coffee with the unhurried manner of men who had nowhere else to be, their presence ensuring that the truck stop remained a safe haven until Sarah's shift ended at 6 a.m. They talked quietly among themselves about neutral topics, upcoming rides, weather conditions, the best routes through the mountain passes, but their eyes never stopped scanning the parking lot and the highway beyond. As dawn approached, and the first legitimate customers began filtering in, the Broken Chain Brotherhood prepared to leave. But before they departed, Jake pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. That man tonight, he said quietly, he's not going away just because we scared him off. Men like that, they don't learn, they just get more careful. So I want you to take this. He handed her a small card with a phone number written in neat handwriting. That's my personal cell. If he shows up again, if you see his car, if you even think you see him, you call that number immediately. Day or night, doesn't matter. Someone will answer, and someone will come. Sarah looked at the card through fresh tears. Why? Why would you do this for a stranger? Jake was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. I had a sister once. Her name was Katie, and she was about your age when she died. A man was hurting her, and I didn't step in when I should have. I told myself it wasn't my business, that she was a grown woman who could handle her own problems. He looked out the window at the lightning sky. I was wrong, and because I was wrong, Katie died alone and afraid in a hospital room while her husband sat in jail pretending to be sorry for what he'd done. I can't save my sister, Jay continued, but maybe I can save someone else's daughter, someone else's granddaughter. Maybe I can make sure that when good people are in trouble, they don't have to face it alone. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me. You just need to promise me something. If trouble comes again, you won't try to handle it alone. Promise me you'll make that call. I promise. Jake nodded and headed toward the door, where his brothers were already firing up their bikes. But before he left, he turned back one more time. And Sarah, that card doesn't just work for you. If you see someone else in trouble, someone else being stalked or threatened, you call us for them too. The Brotherhood looks out for everyone who needs protection, not just the people we've met. Word traveled fast through the truck stop network, the way information always does, among people who spend their lives on the road. Within a week, every trucker, dispatcher, and highway regular from Kansas City to Denver knew that Murphy's truck stop was under the protection of the Broken Chain Motorcycle Club. The effect was immediate and profound. The predators and troublemakers who'd been using the isolated location as a hunting ground suddenly found other places to frequent. The late-night atmosphere became more relaxed, more collegial, as drivers realized they could grab a meal and some rest without constantly watching their backs. Sarah noticed the change immediately. The crude comments and unwanted attention that had been a constant part of her job gradually disappeared, replaced by polite nods and genuine conversation. Truckers started leaving bigger tips, and more than one grizzled veteran of the highways made a point of telling her that she was under good protection. Broken Chain's solid people, an old-timer named Billy McKenzie, told her one night, as she refilled his coffee. They don't start trouble, but they sure as hell finish it. Word is they've been keeping an eye on this place, making sure decent folks can stop for a meal without worrying about the wolves. The financial situation at home began to improve as well. Elena's cancer treatment was showing positive results, and the stress of her medical bills was becoming manageable thanks to the better tips and increased business at Murphy's. Sarah had even been able to start taking a few online courses toward her nursing degree, studying during the quiet hours when the only customers were long-haul drivers grabbing coffee and conversation. 3 months after that terrifying October night, Sarah was working her usual shift when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A young woman, maybe 19 or 20, had come in around midnight with a man who had to be twice her age. She was fidgety, nervous, kept glancing toward the restrooms like she was looking for an escape route. The man with her had the same predatory energy that Derek Walsh had carried, the same possessive attention to the girl's every movement. When she excused herself to use the bathroom, he watched her walk away with the focused intensity of a hunter tracking wounded prey. Sarah didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number Jake had given her. Thunder, came the familiar voice after 2 rings. Jake, it's Sarah from Murphy's. I think I've got a situation here. What kind of situation? Sarah quickly described what she was seeing, and Jake's response was immediate and decisive. Keep them there if you can. Offer them more coffee. Ask if they want dessert. Anything to buy time. We're 15 minutes out. The broken chain arrived like clockwork, rolling into the parking lot with the quiet authority that had become their trademark. This time, the rescue was even more subtle. Tank simply walked over to the young woman and mentioned that his daughter went to the community college in Cedar Falls. Did she happen to know her? The conversation that followed revealed that the girl, Amy, was being trafficked by the man she was with, had been promised a modeling job in California, but had instead found herself trapped in a nightmare of drugs and sexual exploitation. By dawn, she was safe in a women's shelter 2 states away, and her captor was in federal custody facing charges that would keep him locked up for decades. Sarah realized that night that Jake had given her more than just a phone number. He'd made her part of a network of protection that stretched across the highways of America, a brotherhood that included not just leather-wearing bikers, but anyone willing to stand up for those who couldn't protect themselves. A year later, Sarah Martinez graduated from nursing school with honors and took a job at the Regional Medical Center in Cedar Falls. Her grandmother Elena was in full remission, the cancer beaten back by aggressive treatment and an indomitable will to live. They'd moved into a small house with a garden where Elena could grow the tomatoes and peppers that reminded her of her childhood in Mexico. Sarah still kept in touch with Jake and the other members of the broken chain, though their paths didn't cross as often now that she was working days instead of nights. But the brotherhood remained a constant presence in her life, a reminder that there were people in the world who were willing to step up when others needed protection. She'd used Jake's number 3 more times over that year, once for a teenage runaway who'd been picked up by a man offering to help her get to her sister in Denver, once for an elderly trucker who was being robbed in the parking lot, and once for herself when Derek Walsh had briefly reappeared, driving through town and stopping at the gas station across from Murphy's. Each time, the response had been swift and decisive. The brotherhood had a reputation now, a presence, that extended far beyond their small corner of the highway system. Predators and criminals had learned to avoid places where the broken chain was known to operate, and innocent people had learned that help was just a phone call away. Jake Morrison still rode the highways, still answered calls for help in the middle of the night, still carried the memory of his sister Katie like a sacred flame that could never be extinguished. But he also carried something else now, the knowledge that Katie's death had not been meaningless, that her memory lived on in every person the brotherhood had protected, every predator they'd driven away, every woman who could sleep safely because men with motorcycles and leather jackets were willing to stand watch. The Broken Chain Motorcycle Club never sought recognition for their work. They didn't want newspaper articles or television interviews, didn't need awards or official acknowledgement. Their reward was simpler and more profound than knowledge that, in a world full of darkness, they were a source of light. On quiet nights, when the highway stretched empty before him, Jake would sometimes think about the ripple effects of that October evening at Murphy's truck stop. Sarah had become a nurse, using her experience to help other trauma victims heal and recover. Amy, the trafficking victim they'd rescued, had completed her GED and was studying social work, planning to dedicate her life to helping other survivors. Dozens of other people, truckers, travelers, highway workers, had been touched by the Brotherhood's protection and had gone on to extend that same spirit of service to others. Like stones thrown into still water, each act of courage and compassion created expanding circles that touched lives the original actors would never know about. That was the real power of the Brotherhood, not the intimidation factor of leather and chrome, but the simple idea that ordinary people could choose to be extraordinary when circumstances demanded it. That a truck driver could be a hero, that a waitress could be a guardian angel, that a group of middle-aged bikers could change the world one highway at a time. If this story has touched your heart, if it's reminded you that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, that courage isn't about being unafraid but about acting despite your fear, then we ask you to do something important. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to believe that good people still exist in this world. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that prove humanity's capacity for compassion and strength. But more than that, we challenge you to ask yourself, what would you have done in Sarah's situation? What would you have done if you were Jake, sitting in that diner with the choice to get involved or walk away? What are you doing right now, in your own life, to stand up for those who can't protect themselves? Because the truth is, we all have opportunities to be part of the Brotherhood, not the motorcycle club, but the brotherhood of human beings who refuse to let evil triumph through indifference. Every time we speak up against injustice, every time we offer help to someone in need, every time we choose courage over comfort, we're carrying forward the same spirit that drove 6 bikers to ride through the night to protect a stranger. The highways of America are full of predators and heroes, victims and protectors, people running toward trouble and people running away from it. Which one are you? And when your moment comes, when someone needs you to be their guardian angel, will you answer the call? Tell us in the comments. Have you ever been helped by an unexpected stranger? Have you ever had the chance to be that stranger for someone else? Because these stories aren't just entertainment, they're reminders of who we can choose to be when it matters most. The Broken Chain Motorcycle Club continues to ride the highways, continues to answer calls for help, continues to guide. Prove that sometimes the people society fears most are exactly the ones who step up to protect society's most vulnerable members. And somewhere tonight, on a dark highway in America, another Sarah is praying for help, another Derek is planning something terrible, and another Jake is making the choice to get involved instead of looking the away. The Brotherhood never sleeps. The highway never ends. And the fight between good and evil continues. One truck stop, one rescue, one act of courage at a time. Because sometimes, angels really do wear leather jackets and ride Harley-Davidsons. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.